It's much more important what happens the day after the revolution than the day of. And it's much more important what happens the day after the revolution than the day of. And in some ways that is reflective of what happens in therapy too. When someone comes in and we initiate some sort of change process, there's some sort of movement, some sort of understanding, some sort of skill imparted. It's really the most important thing is what happens next. Right. And I think that's sort of the subtext in all this, and even the paper I want to write. I want to think about what happens next, and how do we ensure that what happens next can be somehow a fidelity or somehow connected in the best possible way to what happened the day before.
All right, I like it. It's food for thought. And I don't think we always think that long term necessarily, and maybe we need to. All right, good conversation, Dan. I guess that's it. That's
Boom.
A wrap. We'll see you next time.
Uma Thurman. She's doing that. She's the little girl with the climate change. Uma Thurman.
No, that's
No.
So the transits that are still interesting to us here in 2019 are the ones that are taking place in other solar systems.
Okay.
Now, wait a minute.
Yes.
That implies something, right?
Yes, it does.
That implies that there are actually planets around other stars. And in fact, the very way we discovered planets around other stars had to do with the way that the planets were orbiting around those parent stars.
Right.
And so there's a whole new class of planets that we know a lot about now.
Yes.
That are called extrasolar planets.
Extrasolar planet.
Extrasolar. Extrasolar means they're not orbiting our sun, they're orbiting another star.
All right.
We now know of over 4,000 extrasolar planets.
Wait a minute. 4,000.
Over 4,000. And by the way,
4,000.
that number keeps going up, so it's a little bit hard for me to keep track. I think the latest number I saw was 4,084 known confirmed exoplanets or extrasolar planets.
Incredible.
And so by the way, let me throw that shortening in.
Yes.
You'll see the word exoplanet.
Right.
And exoplanet is just because guys like myself got tired of saying extrasolar planet. It was just too many syllables.
Yeah.
So we just cut it down to exoplanet.
Shorten it up, make it quick, and we're moving on. Okay, I got it.
In with a cool crowd. So if you're in with a cool crowd, you'll call them exoplanets. So when you hear the term exoplanet, just think about a planet around a star that's not the sun. It's around another one of those stars that we see up in the sky.
First of all, that's just amazing that we have that technology,
Right.
and yeah, it's sort of brilliant scientific thinking to figure this out. I think,
and that's what I'd like to address a little bit. How did we find these things, right?
Yeah.
There's two ways that we found exoplanets. And actually the first way is a little bit more complicated. It's a pretty specialized circumstance.
Okay.
That's when a very big, massive planet is orbiting a fairly small star at a fairly close range.
Right.
When that's happening, scientists can actually detect the star moving in and out relative to the Earth. But really what it's doing, it's kind of going around in a circle. Now, we don't see that other planet, but we can see the star moving in a circle. Well, that implies that there has to be another planet out there tugging it and making it move. The
Okay.
planet does not give off light, so it's not bright
Oh,
enough
that's
for us
right.
to see.
Yes, I remember you saying, "Hey, it's all about light."
Right.
That's how we
Astronomy's
get to see
prejudiced to
things.
things that glow in the dark. So that's why we have to watch those things that glow in the dark, right? So the star itself, though, is glowing nicely, and we can see that star moving around in its own little circle because of a common orbit with a very heavy planet. But to us, what we're measuring is the radial movement in and out. And we do that with this thing called Doppler shifts or red shift, blue shift. And so that's the wavelengths of light being shifted relative to because of the motion of that star.
Got
So
it.
one of the ways we can figure out that there are planets around other stars is we can just see that star, we can see that parent star vibrating in and out a little bit, which really means it's going around in tiny circles.
Got
Okay.
it. Yeah.
But there
Okay,
are
that's
only a
cool.
very special few star planet combinations that are just right for us to detect that kind of radial motion.
Well, and it's at such a distance too. And
Exactly.
it's still mind-boggling, and for me anyway, that we can take those tiny little shifts and things, and then extrapolate that's an orbit.
That's right. That's right.
Pretty
Exactly.
cool idea.
But so astronomers came up with then a second way to potentially identify planets that are orbiting other stars.
Okay.
And this still is kind of a Goldilocks situation where everything has to be lined up just right.
Got it.
It's just that it's a more common occurrence, which is something called a transiting exoplanet. So we've talked about transits.
Okay.
Transits in our own solar system or a planet moving in front of the face of a sun. Well, a transiting exoplanet is another solar system out in our galaxy where the planet's planes of orbit are lined up just right to where the planet will pass in front of the face of its parent star.
Okay.
And when it does that, it dims the light from that parent star down a little bit.
Okay.
And then as it moves off the face of its parent star, the light comes back up again. So it's just passing between us. It's not actually touching the star, but
Right.
it's passing in between us and that star. It drops the light coming to Earth down a little bit as it moves in front, and then as it moves out of the way, the light comes back up again. So
Right.
so scientists developed a whole series of cameras that were very sensitive to picking up these slight variations in the light coming from stars due to planets passing in front of them. And they mounted some of those cameras on a couple of spacecraft.
Okay.
The first spacecraft to go into orbit around the Earth that had this technology on it was called Kepler.
Wow.
And so Kepler was a telescope named after Johannes Kepler, who studied planetary motions, by the way. So Kepler was a
You have a story to tell. Columbus Podcasting can tell your story with a world-class video podcast of professional quality. Viewers and listeners can access podcasts anywhere, anytime. ColumbusPodcasting.com. Give us a call today.
All right, Dan. Good to see you.
Saturday
What is going on? Yes, Saturday
I am
morning.
not bathed.
right here.
Not bathed. This is the hat. As I
Yes.
mentioned earlier, I smell like deviled ham. Whenever I don't bathe for a while, I smell like a potted meat.
Oh my goodness.
So,
okay, potted meat.
I
Yes,
have not
there's a
eaten.
topic
I haven't
for us
bathed in a
right
couple
there.
of 4th of July and all that sort of stuff. And
Yeah, we just had the 4th of July. Did you see the fireworks? Or there?
I was in Atlanta.
Celebration?
I was on top of this building and I saw fireworks from they were all, many of them were far away, but I could see them from a surround. Centennial Park, Decatur, Buckhead, all these sorts of places. Boom, they were all going on around you. It's amazing.
Oh, that's pretty
Yeah.
cool. Yeah, I like that idea.
For a brief moment, I felt okay to be alive. Just for
Okay,
a small,
just
just a small
brief
moment. I was,
You know, I think we need to work on expanding that for
We could.
you, particularly,
We could,
so
yeah.
you can enjoy this ride.
you know what else I have found that helps me to enjoy life is this wonderful new refreshing beverage, Supercharged.
Supercharged.
There you
Okay. Okay. I'll just leave it right there. Thank you. I appreciate that mention there. I'm sure the guys upstairs appreciate that as well. So, so what's been on your So what's been on your mind? So that could break into a commercial and it would go south in a hurry.
Okay,
We all
okay.
know that. Everyone watching this absolutely knows that. So
I could do commercials. Let's see. What I was thinking was a couple of things. You brought something up, but I also had
Yeah.
something on the drive up to. It's a family tradition that we listen to David Sedaris audiobooks.
okay.
That's what we For a while there was we were listening to Ayn Rand audiobooks.
Oh no,
But,
that was not happening.
but yeah,
After
yeah.
that didn't happen. But
Suddenly I found at one point my son, he was 10 at the time, I found him attempting to club a poor person to death.
okay.
And that's when I realized we needed to
We might need to
stop,
pay attention a little bit more.
we needed to
as-
stop the Ayn Rand.
Yeah.
So, but so we've
Okay,
been,
people can put those two together later. All right, there we go.
we've been listening to like some David Sedaris, and which is interesting because sometimes some of what he talks about is not kid friendly. So you have to
Right.
hover near the pause button
Okay.
to be able to move through some things because he has this one story about Fire Island that not for kids.
Okay. All right.
So,
Yeah.
but it's funny. It's just not for kids.
Yeah. Right.
So we're up there. We're
part of
heading
your
toward.
job, right? As a
It's-
parent. to,
it's parent, yeah.
listen to that.
But I thought part of my job actually is to guide him through tactical shaming.
Yeah, we talked about your parental shaming earlier.
That's right. I'm going to write a book on
yeah, no,
shame-based
we're
parenting.
gonna- This is. There's a need for an intervention on that for sure.
There is. It probably
Okay.
is. So we're in the car. We're going up, and suddenly Sedaris tells a story that's there. His stories are autobiographical, and I'm sure there's a little liberty taken in this one, but it talks about when he was younger, somewhere in the age between 6. Well, actually, he makes it sound like it started somewhere around that time, when he had these severe obsessive compulsive symptoms. Like he would be in the
Right.
classroom, he would get up 28 times during classroom, and he would go and have to lick the light switch. On the way home, he would have to lick mailboxes, statues in people's yards. He would have to lick the doorknob to his house. He would have to kiss the stairs. All these sort of things, and he would. So, a 10-minute walk would be an hour and a half, and it was just sort of riddled and weighed with all these rituals that you have to go through. Boom, boom,
It
boom,
seems very interesting too because with the tongue, he has to lick things. That's germs and everything.
It's-
and,
that's- but
you
he's-
know, that's got to drive somebody crazy in
Good.
his household. I'm sure. Don't they?
Well, the teacher was rather
Yeah.
upset. It began with the teacher sort of wanting sending a letter home to his mom to address these things.
Okay.
And the teacher, at least from his perspective, wasn't quite understanding what this all could mean. She
Right.
thought it was just simply sort of
Right.
she didn't.
Very bizarre in some ways, and that's why you're not going to come to a quick understanding of that until you look at it a little
Well, yeah,
bit.
it's
We
in
know
you.
that, right?
And you might want to, most of the classroom, you'd want to touch things with a glove. You know, when that kid's around.
Right. Everyone
But-
wears gloves now.
but and he tells a story. And oddly enough, he makes it relatively humorous. But if you've ever been subject to obsessive compulsive symptoms or known someone who has, they are terrifying, and they're hell. They just really are. They're tough, and to be plagued
It's
by
kind of
them.
associated. It's anxiety,
Mhm.
right? It falls into that camp.
Mhm.
And look at anxiety, depression, mental illness, those
Well,
kinds of things, for sure.
And that's where it becomes sort of interesting because if you look at it from a purely biological stance, we could say that maybe it is something awry with the nervous system. We could say that, and certainly in very extreme cases, that there seems to be some genetic pull, there's history of severe obsessive disorder in families often. But one way to think about it would be, because I tend to, I don't know if you know this, but I can look at things psychoanalytically.
Sure.
Sometimes, every once in a while. I
Yeah,
can do
every once
that.
in a while, like that,
Oh, yeah.
every day.
Yeah, it's-
But-
oh, yeah, it's-
we got it.
So we can think about it. If at the core it is anxiety, obsessive compulsive symptoms are an attempt at a solution. It is what Freud called making the best of a bad job. Everything that was all of these obsessive acts, these obsessive thoughts and compulsive acts, are all circle around a central and core anxiety, and that they are attempts to mediate that. They're attempts to be able to do something with it. And if you, for instance, he makes just a passing mention of what was going on at a time when these things really became difficult. And his parents had just moved from the north to North Carolina, and they were living in this temporary house. And so you can see that at that moment he was placed under a tremendous amount of pressure and stress.
Okay.
And as a kid, whatever tendency he had toward compulsive activity and obsessive thought suddenly became increasingly exacerbated as a result of this change. And so the solution became even more drastic and dire. And as you can see, that developmentally there are all these sorts of, particularly as we move into middle school, social pressures, puberty. They're both internal and external stressors that occur as a result of their developmental arc, and they tend to increase. And so
yeah, and that I was interested in his age at the time. You didn't mention that, but I'm assuming it was middle school.
I think so. I think he said he was. I think he was 10 or 11. I may be wrong. But it seemed to be somewhere around that area, 4th, 5th, 6th grade, something like that.
It was just developmental. In terms of
he was right there in that sort of spot.
Okay.
And so you can see that it's an attempt to be able to cope, and it's what makes it sort of like most symptoms. And this is the way to sort of think about this. This is the way, particularly psychoanalytically, we would define a symptom. It provides an immediate and limited but very effective solution to the anxiety at hand. But long term, it tends to feed itself. So it's a symptom that begins to actually reinforce itself and make itself worse. Because if his anxiety on some level was feeling alone and vulnerable, moving away from friends and family and a network of connections that somehow made him feel supported, as soon as he comes to a new place, licking doorknobs and light switches is not going to make you connected to people.
No, as a matter of fact, it's going to run people in the opposite direction, or he's going to suffer some real consequences from other people.
And the vicious spiral of that is, it begins to get worse and worse and worse. And so the problem you fix now requires more of the same fix, and then at some point it can even unmoor itself and no longer be tied at all to the thing that initially started.
Okay. That's
so in his case, it seemed to, if his story is accurate, it was remarkably debilitating. And for him, it wasn't until he had maybe a bit more control over it. It wasn't until he started smoking as a young adult and doing drugs that he was able to do something with those things. And he would talk about how the ritual of smoking, lighting a cigarette, of stepping away to smoke, all these sorts of things were a way for him to suddenly, once he picked up chain smoking, to develop a set of compulsions and rituals that were more socially acceptable. And so we made that trend. Now, why his parents didn't take him to a therapist, I don't know. That in of itself this was in the 70s, I guess.
Excuse me.
Late 60s, early 70s, I guess. That's when he was.
Right. It might be
but,
some kind of taboo against that.
But that also could be diagnostic, that the family, simply just, so I don't know. And if you've listened to any of his stories, he's lots going on.
Yeah, it seems like there is a lot going on with him, but he's prolific, and he's on NPR, and he's on all of these I guess the shows in some regard. So seems to be doing pretty well and pulled his act together, at least literally.
He doesn't have his own drink yet, but he's not quite at that level of success, but he's moving in that direction.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. So it took a sort of a life of its own, moved away from the initial starting point for him with the anxiety and the move and the other kinds of things there. So.
And part of what makes this interesting is that if you think about this psychodynamically, all of us come up with a solution for the things that we feel and the stressors we have. It's just some of us are lucky enough, either through genetic pull or having the right sort of developmental environment, we come up with much better solutions than the ones he came up with. all of us have a way of, we have at least some modicum of maybe obsessive or compulsive things that move through us. But for instance, there's a hierarchy of ego defenses that are talked about in the psychodynamic literature. And one of the ones he exhibits is a good one to have, a sense of humor. So if you are experiencing that initial anxiety that anybody would feel in a social setting, but you're able to tell a joke, that's a sort of defense that mediates your affect, but in such a way that brings people closer. So it's certainly true that humor can go off the rails and can end up running people away. I think my wife probably could talk about that.
I was going to say, we probably have plenty of examples just from the show.
That's
not
right.
only at your home, but
the fact that certain things she says you should not find funny, and I can't help it. It's just,
yeah, that's an immediate signal for you to find something.
It's nuts,
Yeah, that's right.
So, but by and large, it's a much better defense than the compulsive licking of a light switch.
Sure.
And so, but all of us have a pattern of symptoms, adaptive or otherwise, that we make use of. And they become something that's often referred to as character structure. They become, it's reflex, it's like an autopilot, it's like an implicit map of our insides and our outsides that we sort of follow. And built into that are these solutions we come up with, these ways, and they are embedded. They're not something we're often aware of. They mediate automatically and reflexively. And part of what happens in therapy, if our man Dave Sedaris were to, as a kid, show up, part of the goal would be is to help him to name and to acknowledge at least some of the anxiety he's experiencing. If you created a space, if he were a younger child and you did play therapy, for instance, you could find a way for him to be able to put into words in some form of mediated action the sort of stressors that the move made. Since he's a little older at the time, you might get him to be able to tell you directly, or in the stories he speaks of. If you ask him what he's been doing and he starts telling you about a TV show he likes, sometimes those are small windows into talking about characters that he identifies with. And it becomes some small movement for him to begin to put into words instead of these reflexive actions, the things he's attempting to mediate. And you create what's known as an environment of dyadic regulation,
Okay.
as opposed to the solitary. There's dyadic regulation and there's solitary regulation. That's not what it is. But there's a fancy term for it. But
Okay. Got it.
when he is in these obsessive compulsive symptoms, he is stuck outside of the potential for dyadic regulation. The story begins with the teacher sort of making fun of him and sending a letter home.
Right.
The story begins with a failure of potential dyadic regulation. If she had sat down with him, and it may not have been helpful for her to say, why do you keep doing this?
Right.
But she could have sat down with him and said, hey man, I know you're new here. When did you guys move down? She could have started there.
Okay.
That would be the moment of potential dyadic regulation. If that were successful in a successful treatment, part of what happens, including maybe helping him to sort of name some skills he could utilize, giving him some tools to navigate these things, but he also would be able to internalize. He would bring the teacher with him. And in the act of dyadic regulation, you sort of internalize that sort of stuff, and it becomes a new map, a new reflex, more adaptable. That makes some sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. It does make sense because the idea that we all are on this continuum a little bit with this OCD, the obsessive compulsive kind of thing, and that we build some kind of structure as we go along. But for him, it was an extreme. I mean, licking all these objects around in this world must have just horrified all the people close to him.
And
look for a significant reason for this in some way.
And you can see that it leaves him increasingly isolated and away from the potential for the level of dyadic regulation that he needs. And probably his family is also under a great deal of stress. I think at the time his mom was pregnant with his brother, I think. So there were always familial pressures. So, and I think he had at that time 2 older sisters. I think he has 3. Maybe he has 3 older sisters.
Wow.
Maybe, I think that's right. And or maybe a younger sister. I think he has a younger sister too, or maybe I'm wrong. But so there was nothing there, or there was minimal things there to help him to be able to cope outside of that reflexive symptom.
Yeah, I'm wondering too. I mean, it seems like it was unconscious. He wasn't going in and saying, "Oh, when I get to North Carolina, I'm going to start licking the light switch." This was something that just manifested itself. What's the explanation? I mean, why couldn't he realize? Wait a minute, and think through this in some way, kind of self-regulate. What do you think?
Well, it's interesting because if you go with when I've worked with patients with OCD. Oftentimes, with them, there's something dangerous about thinking it. There's something dangerous about getting close to it. There's an example that I can't remember the name of the text, but with a woman who had her husband had taken a job, and she had just moved into a new city, southern city, middle of nowhere, small town, and she began to, they moved, and she had just had her second child, she had a 2-year-old, and she had a baby. And when she was leaving the house, if she were leaving the house with a sitter or by herself, especially by herself with the kids or whatever, she would have to check the stove 500 times, she had to go back and forth, and she would have to do the locks almost 100 times. She just would, and she'd always had some compulsive trends, but they'd really become incredibly exacerbated. Well, part of a way to think about this, what she may need to think to move past that, if we take a psychodynamic step, is to think about the anger she may have toward her husband, the anger she may have toward her kids. There may be an unconscious desire for the stove to actually burn the house down because she might want to be free of all the pain and struggle and stress that she's under.
Right.
So there's a knot, there is a conflict between different parts of herself that find themselves tied to this symptom. And to untie the knot, you may have to get connected to things that are very difficult to think. Maybe even things that are impossible to think. For Sedaris as a little boy, he may not have the capacity to be able to name these things. He's never, if he had lived in his hometown up until he was 10 years old, he doesn't have the words to know what moving means. Someone may at some point may have attempted to, so I think that's part of it. So sometimes the feelings are too much, but sometimes there's a conflict too. There is, and this is very psychoanalytic and maybe controversial in a number of quarters, but at least with some obsessive symptoms, there's a danger to really peering under the symptom, because what you find there can be maybe very dangerous and difficult. No one wants to think that they want to burn their family down.
Right.
But
You're having those kind of very horrible, unthinkable kinds of thoughts, and being able to confront those, and that's hard enough for anyone to do.
A number of folks that I've worked with throughout the ages, I'm not that old. I'm old, but I'm not that old. But throughout my career as a male hand model, throughout my career as a therapist.
What is it that you do? We gotta figure that out one day.
Yeah, what do I do?
That's another show. We'll get to that.
But oftentimes, some of the symptoms, the patterns you see will be around things like pedophilia. Oh, I think I'm a child molester. I think I'm a horrible person. And that they can, they'll can't drive past the park because there'll be kids there, and they'll suddenly, oh my God, what a horrible person. And sometimes the symptoms serve the purpose of, or at least part of their purpose, is to punish. That the things that I feel are too much, and to project condemnation and aggression outward are a way to tie that knot. They offer a quick and not so easy, very difficult solution. Part of the work is to get someone to be able to, if not directly peer under what conflict may be arriving at that, getting them better at being able to feel the things that they feel.
Right.
I can think of an individual who had some those fears of pedophilia, and he had graduated from a graduate program and had just started a fairly lucrative career and was beginning to experience some success when his obsessive compulsive symptoms began to reach a crescendo.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the work with him was untying this knot to see that at least part of this had to do with the fact that he was now more successful than his dad.
Mm-hmm.
That up until now he had lived under this idea that his dad was as good as it could get, was second to God in terms of his place in the universe, and to suddenly live in a world where he began to think about his father differently, his very success began to wreck the balance in the world that he had. And so beginning to get him to touch on those things began to get him to be, and it's difficult to see, well, how does fear of molesting kids connect with this wrecked by success narrative? But what is central to it is really just affect. It is feeling. Symptoms are an attempt to be able to mediate inner experience, and that can tie all sorts of things together that often seem not connected at all.
Right.
Or it could be that it was necessary for me to do that because he had good insurance and I wanted a boat.
Okay, this was we were straightforward there. We just went off the rails just a little bit about the boat, but
I really don't
no,
like
it's
boats.
it's difficult to face these kinds of things, and if the context of the family we're in and the environment that we're in makes it harder to do that, sure, we're going to shy away from that. We'll find reasons not to look at that. And as you said, it may be too horrifying for the person.
It's it ain't easy being human, and that's part of the takeaway from this is that you can look at someone with the extreme symptoms that Sedaris had with the licking of the light switch, but we can see embedded in that something existential, something that is central to the human condition. We have to come up with a solution that allows us to live, and we are not solitary in that. We don't do it by ourselves. It requires people in our life to help us to do that. And no matter how good they are, sometimes they're not good enough in some ways. We have genetics and biology give us a certain, there are certain factors there that we are, like cards we are dealt. All of those things sort of swirl together, and we come up with a way to do something with those. And when you look at an extreme situation like Sedaris, think about yourself. You think about the things that you do. Think about the way in which you mediate stress. One of the more common ways would be, lots of folks, the first thing they do when they come home is either on the weekend or usually the weekend they'll Netflix binge.
Right.
And you may say to yourself, on one level, that's okay, Netflix binge, but that can be
By the
if
way,
you're not.
it happened at my house this couple of days ago with the third season of Stranger Things.
Stranger Things,
there you go.
yes.
So.
That's
Sorry, I didn't mean to take you off.
yeah,
on that.
we have. I gotta watch that Stranger Things. That's that one about it's got Ducky in it.
I'm not going to say anything. I tried to talk about it the other day. I was shushed at the house
Okay.
because we didn't want to reveal anything.
Okay,
So,
all right, okay.
Try to be
But see,
respectful.
a Netflix binge can be symptomatic because it can be another solution to mediate certain affect states. We talked before about that notion of the euthymic window. We can move to a place of compulsive activity in the Netflix binge, and it's different than licking a light switch, but it can in the end keep us maybe even stuck in some ways that Sedaris also was. A weekend spent Netflix binging doesn't allow you to think about the week before, the Monday through Friday, that generated the need for that compulsive activity. And it is possible, if you are allowed to get close enough to things that pushed you toward that symptom, to suffer just enough to feel them, you might be able to come up with a more adaptive solution. You may be liberated. You may grow in a way that allows you to have more of a life than a life that you have to attempt to escape from through a screen.
Right. Well, I guess we have to use what we have at hand in some ways. So what happens if you don't adapt to this? I mean, you were talking about, I mean, he obviously kind of pushed through this and worked through it in some ways.
He made a lot of dough. The Sedaris guy, he's successful.
Yeah,
He's got, what happens when you don't have the opportunity to work through? That sounds like a terrible place to be in your life, and it would constrain you from ever kind of growing. I think there are folks who are literally debilitated, who are trapped. There used to be a saying in shrink circles that if you scratch the surface of an obsessive, you get a psychotic. And what that really means is that untempered, and what often happens is, as part of our developmental arc, is a lot of emotionally difficult or a lot of psychological symptoms can have some level of remission as one moves through age. They can sometimes, and so it could be that folks who initially have these sorts of things, they may even out. They may find a way that they may disperse. You'll notice lots of pre and adolescent and post-adolescents will develop certain tics. Those will come and go, and those may be connected with the rapid myelinization of different hemispheres, which can be connected with increased executive functioning control, all that sort of stuff. So there are neurological sort of hallmarks and markers one move through, but some folks these things don't remit, and instead they find themselves trapped forever. They do.
It sounds like a rough place to be for a lot of folks. Well, I was told at one point that being a little bit OCD was good while you were in graduate school, and you're working on advanced studies. So
I was told a little psychopathy was good.
Okay.
Until they found the bodies, and then they were like, "Look, man,
you gotta stop this if you're gonna graduate." Okay, I heard that. Yeah.
But within Western culture, especially, OCD, a little bit of that is good. We sort of have to, in some ways, differentiate between OCD and OCPD. Depending on who you're talking to, those can be radically different things. But if the capacity to develop and maintain structure certainly is within Western society very important. OCPD, the more central thing is control. That also, a little bit of that can be important. You have the capacity to be able to direct and mediate and control over the things that you feel and things that you do. So, would come in handy. That said, though, I'm sure you can think of folks that you may have attended graduate school with or professors, for instance, who did that, and then
we had students in there.
Students, yeah, you probably have
let's cover everybody.
Don't.
As best we can.
Yeah, I've had bosses and administrators.
Everyone up the line.
There are lots of ways
Yeah.
where you are, there used to be when you were a kid, I haven't heard my son say this, but when I was growing up, you would say, step on a crack and break your mother's back.
Yeah.
And this saying goes all the way back to Freud. Freud writes about it, and it's called the Thalian principle.
Okay.
I think I may be mispronouncing that. It's the idea that, for Freud, it's there is an excessive enjoyment about dancing around cracks that could potentially kill your mom. And that's in some ways the essence of a symptom. To lick a light switch doesn't just mediate inner tension, it brings with it its own sense of enjoyment. A guy by the name Jacques Lacan, again, not Shaka Khan, very different people.
I know.
use that.
The albums are different. The music is completely different.
Very different. You can dance to both of them, though. But he called it jouissance, and it's the idea that there is an excessive pleasure to these things. So part of what also drives a symptom is if you're just walking along and trying not to step on cracks, but if suddenly in your mind you fantasize, if I step on this crack, I'll kill my mom. Suddenly it becomes a game. It begins to have there's a charge to it.
Right.
And so Lacan, he wants to emphasize that there is an enjoyment, an excessive enjoyment in our symptoms. They allow us to, there is something there, a sort of obscene pleasure that drives these things too. And then part of untangling is being able to do something with that as well.
Right, there's a lot to manage in these situations for folks going through this, but a little bit goes a long way, as they say. So maybe we'll figure out what you need to do in therapy. But I think you said it earlier that we need to approach these issues in some ways that without the blame necessarily. Because I think your example a few minutes ago was like the teacher coming at the person and saying, what's wrong with you, as opposed to talk about what the situation was like moving to North Carolina.
But that does, in some ways, go against my shame-based parenting techniques.
Parenting. I hope you don't use that in therapy. Do you use it? No.
Shame,
I would take that question back.
Shame-based parenting. It would be, you lousy light switch looker. That's not really going to help. That's not.
No, that's not going to help. And as well,
well, it's interesting because it actually can. Well, shame doesn't help. But one of the things that we talk about in one of my favorite cats, Lily B on there, says that our first role as therapists are to survive the patient. And I would say that our first role of any social encounter is to survive the other. And so someone who is licking your light switch is a harder person to survive. Someone who is in front of you, rocking back and forth, crying hysterically, saying you're a child molester because they had these thoughts, is hard to survive. So part of what, to be able to lean in, to be able to mentalize the person across from you, is to be able to, as best you can, see the humanity, and if you can, also see where your own symptoms may lie, that you are at least part of that continuum. I may not be someone who licks light switch, but I am someone who does this and this and this and this.
Right.
So.
Wow. There's a lot to think about there.
But, and hopefully the thinking involves someone with really good insurance, because I got a boat.
Yeah, you're boat.
No, I got to get a boat. Right now, I couldn't afford a dinghy.
Right. How about a float for the pool that we've heard about?
Yeah, like those floaties. Yeah, I couldn't even afford floaties.
Floaties, no floaties.
Floaties.
That's terrible. That's a terrible situation. Well, we'll take donations at the end of the show. Pitch in for some floaties for you.
I think we should work in commercials, like the guys upstairs. We'll do a commercial for them.
Let's leave the guys upstairs out of this conversation until we bonded our friendship. Okay, then we can move.
That's
forward.
actually a referral to not God, but as people don't realize, we are polytheists. So we believe in many gods. So that's reference right to the gods who are guiding us, and Zeus and Apollo and
others,
and Ed Norton. I don't know.
Or the tweet of God, I think, is out there on Twitter. So
what is it now? The tweet of God?
Yeah. That's God tweets now.
God tweets.
Some situations, but they can't shut him down for some reason.
I hope he's not tweeting anything
violated.
Anything from Leviticus, Wear mixed fabrics. I'm gonna send you to hell.
Those things I wish I hadn't brought up at this moment, but that's what we do sometimes. So what do you know? All right, man. Well, that's been very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So, what else?
Well, you're not supposed to have. Is this like radio? You can't have dead air.
We can have dead air. Yeah.
Some people would say
It's called post-production.
Here it is.
So we
Here
can,
it is.
we just find that moment where we can stop to get to the next
I think there are
one.
only two kinds of air in this room: hot air and dead air. I think there's really you got no.
Which is more? I don't know.
Well, you brought us up a little earlier, and in some ways, there's a way to connect these
Yeah. Well,
about
I
ideology and what
people
people.
certainly want to talk about it.
So we can say that for later if you want.
Yeah, well, we need to have a longer time to kind of get into it, but let's talk about it for just a second.
Well,
Set this up, sort of a.
You talked about this notion of
Precursor.
ideology, like why are people like, let's we should remain apolitical, or do we wade into the fray?
Well, I would say at this point there's no way escaping from the
Well,
politics because it's in the air that we breathe at this point. So
Well, I have a
just want to
couple
be
of
careful that we don't go.
of friends from Tennessee where I grew up who are very conservative. And so they often send on the Facebooks. I don't know if you got one of those Facebooks, or if you know any that does.
I've heard of the Facebook.
But I got one of the Facebooks, and they send these, and they often say things like, immigrants go home. I don't like line breakers, or that was one they go about breaking in line, there are pictures of Trump as if he was drawn a little like he might be some sort of Christ figure.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's an ideological component to that.
Sure.
And you were saying that why do people cling to that? Why do people
that's
sort of
kind of
say,
the question. Why do we need that? In other words, we can't really sort of independently think about things as they come and make choices in that. We have to sort of join a particular ideology and then march to that tune.
Correct.
And that I find that very interesting.
this is how this connects, because we'll go with Lacan again. Lacan has a famous saying that reality is structured like fiction.
Okay.
And only the non-duped err. That's another one.
Okay.
And
we may have to have some disclaimer at the end of this show, but and also a definition, some terms used
we could
during
have-
this show.
but what he means by that is that the only way you can be wrong is not to be fooled. And what that means is that we can only exist or make use of reality through some sort of mesh, through symptom, through our own histories. It is always to some degree wrong. So there is a fiction that we create to be able to, that it involves us and the people around us, and this fiction is how we move through the world. And it is always to some degree untrue, because it has to be. It is always to some degree unfinished. And what happens with rigid ideological structures is they become rigid, fascistic, and they no longer allow for the movement that what one needs to have with our necessary fiction. You could imagine a dialectic of illusion, disillusionment, and illusion and disillusionment that allows the growth of a mind and a spirit to be able to get bigger and bigger and embrace the world in a better and better fashion. But on some level, we have to cling. When we talk about learning theory, for instance, there's also a famous philosopher that said, all learning there is no learning without suffering. And that's the whole notion of assimilation versus accommodation from P. James' standpoint. That to assimilate is not to alter the fiction and the illusion we live with. To accommodate it, however, is to have to alter that, and that is almost always painful. So, and I'm picking on my friends in Tennessee, but for instance, this notion that, immigrants go home, nobody likes a line breaker. They may be narrowing their idea of what what makes this ideological is, in many ways, that most ideological systems often have, Lacan calls it a quilting point, or some notion or idea that sort of ties everything together. A lot of right-wing ideology, this notion of freedom. Freedom isn't free, or this notion of America almost as if it's a sort of a saturated symbol. Well, in this case, it's the immigrant, and that there are outsiders that we should be united against, and we should be united against them underneath the American flag, and they are trying to get in. They're doing something unfair and wrong. And so that is a helpful illusion to have because it makes the world make sense. It creates a fiction that you can live under. But there's a tremendous amount of information that has to be repressed, or in fact, you can also, what often happens in these systems, this is all psychoanalytic now, the immigrant gets to own all the projections. You don't have to think about your own difficulties in a certain way because you can project them into the immigrant.
Right.
So it offers again that really tidy fiction illusion that one can live under. But what's missing in that, what was challenging is if you were to take my friend from Tennessee and we were having, I said, well, what if you realize that a certain percentage, I don't know what percentage are, but 30% of those are actually women and their babies. They are fleeing because if they stay where they're at, they might be killed. Or that they see a promise for a world where their children may have the things you've been able to give yours. What should they do? Should they stay where they're at? And if you were to say that, would it open up the possibility of some level of accommodation? Doesn't mean that he suddenly has to, throw away his entire platform of immigration. But there's the possibility of being able to think about this differently. Now, as an aside, we've talked in here about Slavoj Žižek, and he got in a lot of trouble. He made a lot of his friends upset when he said that he said it in a way that was very provocative. But what he said is, as long as we focus on the immigrant, we are never going to fix the global problem. Why in this world where we have enough resources are there places that people want to flee from? The right focuses on erecting borders, and the left focuses on creating a space for these people to come to. The real issue, neither are tackling. Why are there places in the world that people need to run from? That's what we need to fix. And that an ideological system keeps you from being able, the illusion of the system keeps you from being able to directly deal with the thing you need to. We don't often ask ourselves that question.
No, it's probably just too tough for us. And besides, if you're in this ideology, one or the other, or ones that are out there, it's comforting in some ways. It's not. I mean, it's nice to have all the people around you agreeing with this, and you have it. You feel like part of the team, if you will, and it's a safe space in some ways to kind of project it. But what you were saying was, this is all fiction. Because there's a bigger question.
And we would say that again from a Lacanian perspective. That's why the non-duped error. If you really want to get in trouble, then in a way talks about this notion of red and blue pills. Mm-hmm. That to truly be awake, if there was such a thing that you could take a red pill that made you completely aware as best you could the world around you, it would be a buzzing confusion. You'd be assaulted by all the things around you.
There's just too much going on, and contradictory thoughts, and ability, and ambiguity, and so forth.
Yeah, this very table, would it is far more in flux than our senses allow us to know. The world around us is far more in flux than the world that our senses allow us to know. So there is no such thing as direct perception. There's always apperception. It's always filtered through both the limitations and the developmental maps that we've been given. And an ideology is just a specific kind of map. And it's usually the sort of map that an entire culture moves under. There's capitalist, there is socialist. Socialism also is like somebody sent me a meme to one of my friends from Tennessee, very conservative. He said that this is no longer Democrats versus Republican. This is America versus socialists. Trump 2020. And you'll notice that now that could be either a clever marketing tool that Karl Rove somewhere decided to come up with.
What happened to that guy?
I think he
somewhere in the background something's going on. I'm sure.
Yeah.
All right, but yeah.
But but it's a wonderful sort of ideological device because it's an attempt to be able to say that if you don't support Trump, you're not an American.
Right.
And you're this thing called a socialist, which is what Lacan would call an empty signifier. What does that really mean? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's like Zizek talks about this, the Schrodinger's Mexican. And if you'll know that a lot of this immigration, that there are the Mexican individuals coming across the border illegally, either stealing our jobs or doing nothing and soaking up all our Social Security. How can they do both? So
Yeah, you run into a contradiction at some point where it doesn't make sense.
well, what Zizek was saying is because it's an empty signifier. It doesn't really mean anything, not really. It's just a way to be able to bind all these things together. So when you say the word socialist, what does that really mean?
Real.
And the person on with the bumper sticker, if you ask them, they may come up with a whole bunch of list of things. Many of them which could be just as contradictory. You know, so let me get this right. Socialists want to do this and this and this. And when you begin, well, wait a minute, have you met one of them? Well, no, you said they're everywhere. Well, where is this? Well, you know, they're Bernie Sanders. And so it sounds like, you know, Bernie Sanders is, you know, so, and then when you begin to unpack that, well, you know, it doesn't. So you're saying Bernie Sanders wants the government to outlaw churches? Is that what you're saying? And then there often becomes this sort of like, but there is an empty signifier in there dancing around that is there simply as a placeholder to keep this ideological system in place. It sort of whirls around it, right?
Right, and the contradictions don't seem to matter. I mean, if you're watching the times we're in and all the media and what's happening in politics and so forth, it seems like there are direct contradictions, but they're either excuses or they just go on without commenting about these things. I find that very difficult to understand.
Well, in the commentary, like, and it can be difficult in lots of ways because some folks on the left, and there are folks on the left criticizing that the Me Too movement and awareness of misogyny and abuse itself, if we're not careful, could become something other than we intend it to be. That's a controversial subject because I'm not really sure, you know, there's ideology in that statement too. But it is possible that, you know, if you go back to Zizek's idea about where we get tripped up in immigration, if we focus, and I think we mentioned before, he talked a lot about some of this conflict with transgender rights, that what often seems to happen is we're just finding a way to integrate one more person into the world instead of this one more person may be able to have the seeds for change for the entire world. So those on the outside, if you ask in Nazi Germany, it talks about the figure of the Jew. And for the Nazi ideology, they were like, you know, they were like Schrodinger's Mexican. On one level, they were degenerates who did nothing but sucked up resources, but they also controlled everything. You know, and like,
Right.
okay,
How could that be?
how could that be? But you know, but that's because in the end, they served a purpose, and unconsciously they structured this entire system. But if you were to ask someone on the outside, it is from them they might be able to observe, well, wait a minute, that their vantage point might allow them to see something that people who are trapped in this ideological system can't see, if they were able to speak. So how do we give voice to the marginalized in such a way that they may be able to change the majority? They may deliver a truth that creates an act of accommodation on a societal level. And we have to be careful. We have to find a way to be able to keep that voice intact and able to speak. So.
Yeah, I think we need to have that available to folks. But I mean, at first it's this issue of insight. Am I really thinking what do I believe in and why? Let's get to that point as well and begin to assess things. I don't think people are analytically or otherwise being critical thinkers about it. It seems like we're just accepting of some things because we want to fit in, almost on Maslow, one of the hierarchies of connecting
Seriously,
with
'cause-
others, you know.
and this is kind of some rabbit hole stuff, but particularly if you follow some of the Zizek stuff, he would say beware of critical thinking too,
Okay.
because there's often a need to get lost, and it's often in the stumbling that you find yourself. So it is possible that the repentant racist may have an awareness and may be a potential for change that even the marginalized individual may not be. So it may require the stumble and the fall and then a retroactive critical analysis of the stumble to be able to move the individual forward in the way that we want them to go. You may have to fall down before you can rise up. That may be the model how this is supposed to happen. You may need to lick a few light switches before before you can be aware of yourself. You may have to move, and you have to move through the symptom in a way to get to the sort of truth you need to.
Okay. Well, final idea about this with this ideology notion, and I like the way you tied it into the OCD a little bit there, but the idea of, is this healthy? I mean, to just sort of cling on to the ideology and wear the certain hat and do the certain things, where does it end up? But is it healthy, and how do we get out of it? What do you think?
Well, there's not a lot of, there is some data, and it's often filtered through politics. But oftentimes folks who, depending on how rigid an ideological edifice or system is, and depending if it's on the left or the right, we do know that individuals, particularly if their ideological system is more tribal, to the degree that it is tribal, there are higher incidences of hypertension, diabetes, there are all these sort of ill health effects. So there's some data to suggest that there's something difficult and dangerous about any sort of rigidly held ideological system.
Right.
But I suspect that my friends in Tennessee, one of my friends in Tennessee did have a heart attack like 10 years ago, so, or maybe 3 years ago. So that watch me on Southern Kilo right now, but
No.
I'll try not to.
Try not to.
But I suspect though that on some level it probably is healthy to have some sort of system. And if you stay within a context where there are no cognitive dissonance, if you watched only one news channel, if you've existed within a certain bubble, you probably would be relatively comfortable in that. And we do know that in terms of measures of happiness, it depends on how you, again, that's a hard thing to operationalize.
Right.
But folks who skew toward the right report higher levels of happiness. They report, so the more conservative you are in those sense, and that makes a certain amount of sense because if you move toward the left, you're much more aware of systemic problems. If your ideological system says that God will sort it out in the end, then you can rest easier than someone who believes that we have to fix these things.
We got to work hard to fix these things, yes.
So, I think that's part of what's insidious. We may be saying that to move outside of one's ideological system is to risk health and to risk, it may put you in some sort of danger. If no one learns through suffering, then you're going to have to move through something painful to get outside of an ideological system. So, to answer your question, maybe it would be better if we were all Nazis.
Okay, that was not exactly the answer I was looking for.
I will say this
I don't know
though.
how to recover from that one.
I will say this though. They had cool uniforms.
Yeah, the uniforms were cool. All right, so other than that, this is going to get us into big trouble.
Actually,
You
but
understand
this is
right?
also one of the things that this guy Zizek writes about, because Nazi ideology very much about sex and drugs and rock and roll. It was very much about discipline, rigidity. It was about you weren't supposed to everything in moderation, so there were all this sort of, and so Zizek says the reason why their costumes looks cool because that's where all the renounced pleasures surfaced. That because they weren't allowed to kick it up at home, they would have these Nazi would look like socialist, or no, they weren't socialist. That's not okay. Maybe we can talk about that.
Right. Clarify.
That they weren't. That's why they had these giant rallies where everybody's it's like this sort of political orgy rallies.
Right.
And that the ideological system allowed a return of the repressed in moments like that. So their uniforms were cool because the contents were under pressure, and that's where some of this pleasure surfaced.
Wow.
And those Nazi boots.
And well, here's how it happened, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm going out to my truck out the front door here at 1214 First Avenue to pick up a book that Dr. Hackett and I are going to do a Talk with Mike and Tom podcast coming up pretty soon. And happened to run into two of my favorite people walking down the street. I think I scared them just a little bit. Did I not scare you?
You scared me.
Okay, I didn't mean to. I did. That door
well, you know
opened.
what happened? You didn't scare me.
I think I did.
I think you startled my very skittish significant other. And
Okay,
then
let's
he
get a
lunged up.
close up of him over there
Yes.
being skittish. All right, perfect.
Don't
That's
say
how
boo.
it looks.
Don't say boo.
think
And then he jumped. He lunged. Let me just use a better word. He lunged.
He lunged.
He did.
Yeah.
And then he startled me. And so then.
Well, it all happened when I opened the door. So
That's right.
Yes.
I want to apologize for my opening of the door.
I think
was
that's
trying to
it.
get out of the
I think
building. What
that's
did I
it.
do wrong? I don't know. And absolutely, there is no crime that's been committed here. Okay, I want to make sure. Is that true? Now,
True statement.
you have a background. You tell us a little bit about your background because you may know more about true crime than any of us. What do you think?
Maybe a little bit. I've never dabbled in criminal law.
Okay.
But I do have a background in law. I have a Juris Doctorate. So
Okay, so you're working as an attorney, so you've probably seen some things around. Now you do have interest, and so maybe one of your interests is true crimes. Is that true? I don't know.
Yeah, I do. You know, investigative reporting, true crime, and it's not something I've ever really talked about. I just happened to mention to my current that I like to listen to certain podcasts. But you know,
That's the current right there.
Thank you for pointing. Yes, good. So
No,
can we just say this is my first time in your studio? We talked about people's second times. This is my first time here.
Well, listen.
I'm really enjoying
First,
this.
first of all, welcome. You are
you.
always
Thank you.
welcome here at the studio, and we have a lot of good folks coming in, good people, good podcasts is what we say on our advertising. So, I was telling you guys a story about when Dr. Hackett and the film crew, we went out on the streets of Broadway, and we were asking people to be a part of our promotional video about podcast here. And you can find us at columbuspodcasting.com. So one of the things we asked, do you listen or watch, because it's both audio and video, podcast? And I was surprised. First of all, everyone was watching podcasts or listening to podcasts. Everyone we talked to. That sort of confirmed some things for me. But secondly, when we asked what they liked, a good percentage of the people said, you guessed it,
True crime.
true crime.
True crime.
All right, now what? All right, I'm fascinated. I've said before, I've read a few of those mystery novels. I've got audio books and I'm listening and so forth, but I'm not sure it's true crime. There's an entire category of true crime. So, Shatul, let me ask you, what is your definition of sort of the true crime genre?
So I think, and one of the things what I said to you is, before we get into that, I think we have to really look at, what I find interesting is, it depends who you ask, right?
Right.
So I think people pull different things out of these quote unquote true crime podcasts, just like we get into the books of true crime,
Right.
mystery, suspense. If you go into like the James Patterson type
Right,
stories,
right,
right?
yeah.
We have a character, we have antagonists, we have protagonists, we have the whodunits, right?
Right. There's a plot points that move through and you kind of mislead
you have the
folks
arc.
a little bit. Yeah, arc, and you're
Right.
trying to find, yes.
And then everybody's with you, you're on it, you know who did it. And then there's that dun dun dun, not who you thought.
Wow, yeah.
Right?
That kind of keeps us there, doesn't it? I
It
think
keeps
that's what
us
happens.
there, keeps us right there with you. And so, but then there's that other genre of the cold case. Nobody could figure it out. Maybe you'll figure it out. Let us give you everything we have. You might be the one.
So
There's that
now
whole
wait,
era.
now wait a second. Now, if I like it. First, it's intriguing, but is it is it really an unsolved case, a cold case, and it's kind of left up to the listener to help figure it out?
Depends on what you're listening to. There are some out there that present everything that we have. We're going to, whoever the moderator or the narrator or whoever is the person. Personally, I don't like the cold case files ones. I need to get to the end. I need you to catch it.
Well, I had heard that. Now, somebody just let this slip, and I was listening. But they say, listen, one of the first things you need to do is go to the end of the book or the end of the story and find out who did it, and then work your way back and then start over. I'm not sure that's always true.
Well, not for me. As I said, I think it just depends on who you are. And this comes back to, I'm a lawyer, you're a psychologist, right? That's what we do for a living. That doesn't necessarily always align with our dispositions or our backstory, right?
Right.
So I think we all bring a lot to the table in all of our years of living.
So we might come up with something that no one else.
Or not just for the solving of the mystery, but why are we interested in this? A lot of times when I'm listening to things, what I really like to hear is, how did the lawyers treat these stories that are involved in this? How did they deal with some of the examination of the witnesses? How did they deal with the experts in the case? How did they deal with the law enforcement aspect of it? That's just an interest of mine.
Well, that fascinates me too. I like that a lot, because I want to know